For Kitchener-Waterloo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand up to say some comments about the throne speech. My copy's fairly marked up. I've renamed this "Building Expectations Up in Ontario," and you know you don't. And this remains our concern about this document: is that you don't build a province up by letting the most vulnerable fall behind. And this is a concern going forward with some of the promises in this piece of legislation and some of the promises that have been made during the election period at time as well. You know, the people of this province gave New Democrats a job during this 41st Parliament of Ontario of holding this government to account, and it's going to be a challenging job. And we're very honest about that, and we're very straightforward about it. There's no end to that responsibility, as we've seen already. And I'm proud to have been re-elected by the people of Kitchener-Waterloo to be sent back to Queen's Park and remind this government of their responsibilities and their commitments. And I'm proud to stand with the people of the NDP caucus. We are a diverse group and we're a strong group and we have a great leader. And we are going to hold this government to account and put the people's priorities first in this House going forward. So during the recently completed election campaign, the Liberal government made promises after promise after promise, and for their litany of promises, they were re-elected. And I think it needs to be said that fear can be a very powerful emotion. And during this throne speech, and at nearly every opportunity since then, when a Liberal has found themselves in front of a microphone, they have talked about building Ontario up. In reality, the people of this province have heard as a party that is building expectations up. That is what people hear, because there is a track record that this government has to take ownership for. And part of our role in this House is to remind you of that track record so that going forward, people come first. If this government's recent history is a predictor of the future, we'll see those expectations let down. New Democrats are here to make sure that when the Liberals don't follow through on their promises, the voices of Ontarians to whom the Liberals made those promises to aren't left out while they're let down. This budget, it was a surprising budget, and I agree entirely with our leader. It is not a progressive budget. We still have outstanding concerns with it, as we did 2 months ago. And it wasn't more than 2 months ago that there was no end to the list of people who were lining up to call the Liberal budget progressive. But very soon, if it hasn't already happened, it will only be Liberals who are calling this budget progressive. As our leader has said, you don't have to look at the Premier's budget for very long to realize that it is not a progressive budget. Even Bloomberg News reported that after year one of the Wynne budget, the Liberals' own documents show the deepest freeze in 2 decades. They continued by adding, 2017 Liberal government would drop spending by the most per person since former Premier Mike Harris won election on the deficit elimination in 1995. If you look at the hospital operating budgets that have been frozen, 3rd straight year of frozen budgets for hospitals, amounting to cuts to hospital services. When you freeze those budgets, those are cuts. Ontario Nurses Association has criticized this decision, stating that they remain deeply concerned by the continuing flatlining of funding of Ontario hospitals. Years of hospital underfunding have cut millions of hours of registered nurses' care, increasing the number of high-risk patient care situations. This is the track record. And so this is why we remain so concerned when the budget was presented in May. This government clearly has a revenue problem. I hope that we can all agree with that. The Liberals made promise after promise, and almost immediately after the election, they were warned about the effect their plan will have on this province. We know that Ontario's credit rating was downgraded in 2012 by Moody's. Now, 2 out of the 4 major rating firms have Ontario at the bottom rung of the AA range. Standard & Poor's, which is an ironic name, is leaning toward a downgrade with a negative outlook on its rating. Moody's is leaning toward another downgrade with a negative outlook announced last week. And I want to say why this is so important and why we care about that. Moody's stated that if the government fails to provide clear signals of its ability and willingness to implement the required measures to redress the current fiscal pressures, going forward, the credit rating will go down. The Minister of Finance went out into the public at that time and said, banks are not freaking out. Don't worry, they're not freaking out. Corporations are not freaking out. But corporations are sitting on billions of dollars, and banks, quite honestly, benefit because they make more money out of the deal. But this is why it's important. As government misses deficit targets, which is happening right now, the Liberal government prior to 2012-13, they were on record to reduce their deficit. That is no longer happening. They were making progress. Now they are not. And when governments start piling on new debt, lenders will charge them more to borrow. This means governments have less money to spend on the priorities that they have said are so important, like education, like healthcare, like infrastructure. We just heard this morning, they're in the northern part of this province, infrastructure has been neglected for so many years that you are seeing the effects of that neglect on a daily basis. But in spite of all this, which is quite something, in spite of this, the government continues to ignore the possibility of rolling back their corporate tax cuts. So this is something that we should be able to work together on. Ontario is one of the lowest tax jurisdictions in North America. And with the combination of the warnings we are receiving from credit rating agencies and a government that has made many election promises, we need to look seriously at those eliminating those corporate tax rollbacks. You need the revenue. We're in one of the lowest corporate tax jurisdictions in the country, and you will not be able to meet your deficit reduction projections. You just will not. You do not have the money to do it, or you're going to break promises. So we would contend that the government is quite honestly living in a fantasy world where there are no consequences for their decisions. And actually, I recently read an article in the National Post by Scott Stinson, and this is on the pension, because this is quite interesting. It's that now the Liberals, because they're in a majority setting, and it's a bit of an adjustment for all of us, because I was really enjoying the minority part of it. But Scott Stinson says this about what Liberals can say. Thus, the line in this throne speech about how the proposed Ontario retirement pension plan guarantees financial security for those leaving the workforce. Guarantees. Even though it does nothing of the sort. Are we to believe that retirees who have nothing other than CPP benefits and whatever they amass from an ORPP plan that is not set to begin for more than 2 years are guaranteed financial security under this Liberal plan? So, I mean, it's essentially stating, he's basically stating that they can say whatever they want to say. And we take great exception with that. I mean, I feel like sometimes we're going to be doing the reality check here on this side of the House. So New Democrats know that in order to spend on the critical social programs needed in Ontario, we need to be fiscally sound. Because the Liberals don't seem to understand that point, they presented a plan that threatens service cuts that we haven't seen since Mike Harris. And, you know, even every time the Liberal government brings up the Mike Harris name, which happens a lot, and quite honestly, on the 407 deal, it's a valid point. But when Bill 115 was brought to this legislature in September 2012, Mike Harris wouldn't have gone that far. He would not have squashed collective bargaining rights. He would not have brought in a piece of legislation which would eliminate the rights and voices of those who work in the education sector. So for me, this throne speech really is contradictory on so many levels. This Liberal government did campaign against austerity, and I think that's a fair thing to say. And yet their own muse, now he's being called a muse, economist Don Drummond, recently warned Ontario that Kathleen Wynne's plan will likely result in the elimination of 100,000 public sector workers. The government's response has been to send out mixed messages. One day, the new chair of the Treasury Board, congratulations, says the Liberals will hold the line on public sector spending. The next, she says that perhaps there may be raises if there's enough money. Maybe it's not coincidental that the ratings agencies are looking at a downgrade. What we are hearing is inconsistencies and contradictory comments with regards to the financial and the fiscal situation of this province, which we all have a shared responsibility to take ownership for. But there has to be this collaboration, this listening that people talk about outside of question period time. So, if we are to reflect back on how we got here in this province and what the Liberal record is, obviously some big promises are contained in this throne speech. But we need to remember the Liberal track record. Unemployment has been above the national average since January 2006. Ontario is still down 300,000 manufacturing jobs. During the last session, we were quite clear that the Liberals seem to have just totally written off manufacturing, like as if we don't want to make anything anymore. When we have the research, when we have the innovation, and when those jobs need to be created. Hydro bills have increased by 300% since the Liberals took office, and they are projected to rise another 42% over the next 5 years. I just have a letter right here from the Brick Brewing Company. They have informed me that their last bill went up $75,000 over their 3 facilities. That's an increase of 20%. We are not going to attract manufacturing. We are not going to attract these jobs unless we are serious about getting hydro rates under control. And we brought this issue to the people of this province during the election. We wanted to make sure that there was some streamlining and alignment around the power authorities, those who are regulating our power sources, because there are efficiencies there. And if you continue to do the same thing over and over and over again, then you're just going to get the same result. So with regards to Brick, I mean, this is a company actually that has invested in innovation, that has created good local jobs. This is how a government shows commitment to an Ontario craft brewer or to a small to medium-sized manufacturing. Energy has to be on the table when you are talking about job creation and when you are talking about strengthening the economy. So, as was mentioned already, the throne speech doesn't talk about some key issues, though, that we should all be concerned about. The high hydro bills for our households and for businesses, as I've mentioned the Brick, but they certainly are not alone. The Brick is not alone. I mean, there is a reason why Southwestern Ontario has listened so closely to some of the voices in our caucus, is because they like what they're hearing, because we have some solutions. And we're willing to work with them to keep those jobs in those vulnerable areas, and because they have not been listened to for so long. What else was in the bullet trains to Southwestern Ontario? I can tell you I would have really appreciated a bullet train this morning from Kitchener-Waterloo to Toronto, because I was hydroplaning between 2 18-wheelers in very terrible weather, and I was really happy to make it here. At some points, my language was not the best, but I made it here safely. But the bullet trains, or the high-speed trains, which were touted prior to this budget as being, a key part of getting Southwestern Ontario's economy back on track, no pun intended, but also leading to greater productivity and safer travel, that's not in the throne speech. There's no mention of it there. Kitchener City Council is holding up construction projects like the Margaret Avenue Bridge until it receives direction from this province. So there is a trickle-down effect. When the provincial government doesn't follow through on promises, especially around infrastructure investment, then it has a trickle-down effect to our municipalities. It's a natural thing that happens. They're not going to move forward with that Margaret Avenue Bridge until it gets a firm commitment from the provincial government. As already mentioned, high auto insurance rates, and in the election you would knock on the door and you talked about the big issues, the economy and jobs, but it was the issues that affect the people directly, and insurance rates, they feel it. The people of this province understand that there's a fundamental lack of fairness with regards to auto insurance rates. Despite how well people drive, despite their driving record, those insurance rates continue to go up, even as the government says, no, they're going down. But the lived experience of the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, is contradictory to what you hear from that side of the House. The Financial Accountability Officer, and I want to mention this because I was on the hiring committee to get the Financial Accountability Officer in place, as was the member from Vaughan, as was Mr. O'Toole from Durham. Good guy. I miss him already. And just for the record, Mr. O'Toole and I did not agree with the choice of the Liberal member on that committee. We are looking forward to going forward with that process. But in the press release that came from that member, it said that it was just me. I must be a very powerful person to stop that office from coming into place. And so just for the record, for the public record, I'd like to put the truth right there out on the paper. But I look forward to moving forward with that. I mean, that legislation passed in this House. It passed in this House. I think that everyone in the province of Ontario will acknowledge that a financial accountability officer is needed. You can create a president of the Treasury Board, but you need someone who is outside of that boardroom cabinet table. You need a third party who can actually make sure that financial decisions going forward have some integrity. Imagine it, have some integrity. Yep. And you know what? I look forward to that day when that happens, because it passed in this House, and regardless of the majority status, it still needs to happen. And we're going to follow through on that. Childcare. What was really interesting in the budget, and that the throne speech doesn't necessarily address it, but is that there was an acknowledgement that early childhood educators and personal support workers were very deserving of a wage increase. And on this side of the House, we couldn't agree more. The personal support workers, in particular, when you walk the picket line with them, because they've been fighting for some pay equity for so long, you will see that they have essentially been holding the home care system together. Meanwhile, CCACs and LINs, they get another manager of communications, another public relations manager. There's 3 intake workers in our local CCAC in Kitchener-Waterloo, and they have 9 managers. And yet, personal support workers, last round, they got a 20 cent an hour increase. So there's a real inconsistency around priorities. But they need full-time jobs. And they need full-time jobs, and they need to work in safe conditions, and their work needs to be acknowledged. And yet, in the throne speech, there is no true commitment to stabilizing childcare, and this has been a long-standing issue with this government. When full-day kindergarten rolled out in the province of Ontario, there was no accounting for the negative impact that program would have on community-based childcare. There was no acknowledgement, and we know this because they had to catch up later on, and then they threw the childcare into the Ministry of Education. And so you're continually catching up, but a throne speech and a new budget would be a perfect opportunity to right that wrong. The time is always right to right a wrong, I think, and why not? Why not now in 2014? So there's a litany of things that are not contained within this throne speech, and our leader has actually mentioned already a number of them. I wanted just to talk quickly, though, about this concept of an activist centre, because we're going to be hearing this a lot. And there's a lot of confusion, quite honestly, about it. It sounds really good, though. I mean, it sounds promising. It sounds like perhaps something that a promise can be broken, though I think that we have to remember that on this side of the House. But the promise is to govern from the centre, and also with an activist sort of vein, and within the framework, of course, of deficit reduction. And I would respectfully suggest that those two concepts are at odds with each other, and something has got to give. And so I think that our priority on this side of the House is to make sure that the people who are frontline workers, and that's who we talked about during the election. We talked about the nurses and the personal support workers and the ECEs and the education workers, because there really isn't an acknowledgement that, in the healthcare sector, for instance, where 20% of almost that funding goes to the top echelons of power, of bureaucracy, which continues to grow at the expense and the cost of frontline services. We're going to fight for those people, because we see them as key people in the healthcare system and the education system. And I think that it has to be said that this government does not have a strong record of ensuring that the people that are actually making a difference in the healthcare system, the people who are going into someone's home and helping them get their food and taking care of them, those personal support workers, those are the people that need to be supported. And when we see hospital budgets being frozen for 3 consecutive years, you have to wonder who's going to go, because someone's going to have to go. I was actually really pleased. My local hospital just let go, I think, 2 vice presidents. I guess the question remains, how many vice presidents does a hospital need? And I think that that's an outstanding question, but I'm sure one of us will come up with a good idea about it. As I mentioned, though, this throne speech, Building Expectations Up in Ontario, has some great inconsistencies to it, and I was pleased actually to hear some of the comments from my colleagues in the PC caucus. But I just want to give you a couple examples. Many of you know that worker safety in the province of Ontario is an ongoing issue, and I'm going to be working very closely with our critic on this, because 2 people died in the last 2 weeks from falling. And this is not a new phenomenon. These are tragedies, and they are preventable accidents. And there is a report on the books that the Liberal government has requested back in 2010, the Dean report, which called for mandatory fall protection training, not just a poster, but some actual training. And yet, in the throne speech, it says that you are going to follow through on protecting workers while supporting businesses. And so I'd have to say that this is an ongoing issue and a concern for me. You also mentioned that through partnerships with businesses and persons with disabilities, your government will work to increase the number of employment opportunities for Ontarians of all abilities. And yet, as the AODA standards have rolled out in this province, there has been great inconsistencies. Our own member from Parkdale High Park had to put a Freedom of Information request into the government to find out how many businesses in this province have failed to meet the compliance standards. And yet here in the speech it says you're going to follow through on that as well.
They're building new buildings without doing that.
Exactly. What a missed opportunity. The time to make a building accessible so people can go to work, so people can gain access to employment opportunities, is as the building is being constructed, not after the fact, with a deadline of 2025. There's of course the worker safety, the transit, the youth jobs. Some of this stuff I think that we can actually feel a little bit good about. I mean, we fought for the youth employment strategy in the 2013 budget. We fought for the auto insurance, and we're going to continue to fight for that. Right. We definitely fought for the home care, the 5-day home care guarantee. We saw money directly flow because of our advocacy in that budget negotiations, if you will. And I think it needs to be said that there is still opportunities to actually influence this budget. What remains the outstanding question is, will it still be the same budget given the credit ratings that have come forward? Because if it is, we know what the future is going to be like. We know that you are going to have to make cuts, and you know that we are going to fight those cuts, especially if they affect frontline workers. There is a lot of work to be done in this province. The revenue problem that we have in this province stems from job creation, but there are savings, as we've indicated, in the healthcare sector and the energy sector. To find some alignment, to find some savings, those opportunities do exist. And we are certainly, I have to remain hopeful, because we're looking at 4 years. So the tone and the tenor of this budget negotiation will be very interesting, I think. I'm certainly hopeful, and I know as the caucus is as well, is that we can influence the priorities of people in this House going forward. That's our commitment. That's what the people of this province gave us, that job, and we're going to follow through. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.